The views and opinions expressed by callers, guests, and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the Black Talk Radio Network and Black Talk Media Project. Black Talk Radio is new black media for the new millennium.
Lift your eyes up, let your wise rise up. See the signs of the times. If it's time, rise up, rise up. When death and hell dwell among all God's people, when those we chose and trusted have become completely corrupted and inherently evil, when the feast that feeds you starves our father's children, when snuff, porn, and pedo forms begin to get top billing, rise up. When famine claims millions, when justice gives blind eyes to billions, when the Lord's anger is no longer feared, if his protection is gone and your enemies are near, if you've seen the seas spill over and the mountains shake, break, and fall, if the moon ever turns blood red and you can't see the sun at all, rise up. No matter if the prize is high in the sky.
Abolitionists Radio on the Black Talk Radio Network, a program that seeks to educate, inform, and agitate on the issue of 21st century legalized slavery. Currently hosted by social activist and spoken word poet Max Parthas, with Black Talk Media Project founder Scotty Reed, and commentary by guests and callers. On this weekly broadcast, we discuss recent news on legalized 21st century slavery and human trafficking as it is allowed through the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, along with projects and people who help combat it. As of this month, we are the official educational and introductory program representing the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights Coalition. If you want to know about the new abolitionist movement, what it is and what it's about, this is officially the place to start. On this day in 1765, the British Parliament enacted the Stamp Act, which eventually led directly to the stamp tax rebellions and finally the Revolutionary War of Independence. For nearly a decade, between 1765 and 1775, colonialists resorted to rioting, burning, looting, and committing acts of extreme violence against tax collectors, British officials, and colonists turned British cohorts. This was the catalyst for the birth of America 252 years ago today. We are now 3 days away from November 4th, a day of national sustained protest organized by Antifa. The conspiracy theories are flying furiously and describing everything from an armed uprising by racists to a massive military EMP wave blackout. So let's talk about it. We'll also discuss how local jails have turned into debtors' prisons as cities and counties imprison poor people who can't pay fines for traffic violations, minor offenses, or court costs. We'll play a clip from On Contact with Chris Hedges interviewing Alex Vitale talking about that very issue and its rampant constitutional violations. Hat tip to Otis Griffin. Tonight, we want to go over the humanitarian crisis going on at McCormick Correctional Institution in South Carolina. Then we'll discuss the convenient rewrite and whitewash of Civil War history and slavery by White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. No matter what you talk about, the conversation keeps coming back to the white elephant in the room, slavery. In business news, the GEO Group International Prison Slavery Corporation is giddy with how much money they are making and have done everything but give ICE a bouquet of roses and an award for being their #1 customer. So, question, did Abraham Lincoln know about convict leasing? Answer, you're damn right he did. We'll go over his private letter to Alexander H. Stephens on December 22nd, 1860, and show how that explains the 13th Amendment. Our abolitionist in profile tonight is Elizabeth Freeman, 1742 to 1829, also known as Mum Bet. In the segment For Freedom's Sake, A History of Rebellion, we will remember the November 15th, 1842 rebellion of Joseph Vaughn's slaves against their Cherokee masters. Our rider of the 21st Century Underground Railroad is Bobby Hines of Detroit. Incarcerated at 15, Hines had been condemned to life in prison without parole. 28 years later, his release came after the U.S. Supreme Court last year extended a ban on mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders to those already in prison. Have a question or comment? You can call us toll free at 1-866-510-9025. You can chat with us and others by logging in at uberconference.com/Black Talk Radio Network. Once again, I'm Max Farthers. What's happening, brother Scotty Reed? How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing a lot better, man. I had a little headache going on. I took a couple of aspirin, and I'm good to go. And I'm just ready to talk about tonight's stories. I also do want to shout out to the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights Coalition. We are very honored to be the official radio program for the movement, and we will do our very best to represent.
Absolutely, brother. I feel the same way. We just had the meeting this past Sunday, the monthly meetings, and we had talked about it previously in another meeting. And Krista Roundtree announced that they had no problem with that, and it would be a great idea. I mean, there is nowhere else where people are focusing on it in a radio program or any media content in the way that we are. This is what we talk about every week in every way you can imagine. And if you come here only for one program, you are going to find out more than you have ever imagined. And we're going to wrap it up in a nice, tight, little, neat bow for you to take home and share with other people.
Most certainly, most certainly. And we've been dutifully doing this program for the past 5 years, and just seeing the change in the public conversation and seeing that change in the conversation shift from mass incarceration to slavery, from every other name that people want to call it, police and profit, all of that is tied to slavery. And I'm just very happy to see the fruits of that labor, because all you have to do, a spiritual teaching that I believe in is you sow seeds. Like the story about Johnny Appleseed going around sowing abolitionist seeds. He wasn't, but that's what we doing. But sowing abolitionist seeds and then seeing how they spring up in different areas. And, I feel like new abolitionists are being born every day in this time period.
Yes, indeed, man. And I got to give a shout out to my brother Shaka Tsunami, who is sitting here next to me. Hey, what's going on? He's here from ITV Global. And he's also an abolitionist, representing an abolitionist organization out of Ohio. It's our Connect in Ohio. And I think we're leaving here tomorrow, right? This is our last day in South Carolina. All right. First thing in the morning, it's time to ride. So we'll be heading out Ohio tomorrow, apparently. Well, that's cool,
definitely,
man.
We want y'all to have safe travels behind these enemy lines.
Ohio has been coming up a lot lately.
Yes.
I have been really researching the 13th Amendment's exception clause. We've been looking for any kind of dialogue about that particular part. And I've read everything from Frederick Douglass's speech in May of 1865 at the American Anti-Slavery Convention, where William Lloyd Garrison proposed disbanding the society because of the 13th Amendment. And Frederick Douglass talked about that there, specifically about the 13th Amendment. He didn't mention anything about the exception clause. And then I looked through the debates. I couldn't find anything about the exception clause. And the only thing I remembered is that at one point when Hannah X had approached, what's the author out there from New York Times name?
Man.
About the 13th Amendment.
You put me on the spot. Sean King.
Sean King. Hannah X had approached Sean King. He mentioned some debates going on in the 1860s regarding the exception clause, but I have yet to find them. It's as if the word didn't even exist except for in the exception clause. And it was a senator and a congressman from Ohio who brought it to Lincoln and proposed it to him. One congressman in particular was an abolitionist himself, a white abolitionist working with the Underground Railroad. There's some amazing, interesting stuff I found out. And he was the guy that handed Lincoln the 13th Amendment in its entirety as a proposal.
Wow.
So this abolitionist working on the Underground Railroad had in his hand the very first exception clause, which was the third proposal actually, but the exception clause with the amendment that says except for prisoners duly convicted, and never mentioned it at all. I couldn't find any information on it.
Well, you know, Max, how I feel about Abraham Lincoln, who I actually was posting some information about today when somebody mentioned John Kelly, and I'll bring that up later when we get to that story. But yeah, I don't see how you can call yourself a tried and true abolitionist, but yet you support exceptions for slavery. That just does not compute in my mind. You either you for or you against. It ain't no riding the fence. You know what I'm saying? So we look at these people with such reverence, and I'm not blaming anybody. I did not know that the exception clause even existed until going on 6 years ago, because I'll be 51 at the end of this month, and I did not know. And when I did find out, I was moved to act, and my first move was to find Max Partis and say, hey man, we need to do a radio program telling people about this.
Scotty was like, we need to get these voices out here, brother. We got to get this done. And I was like, yes, let's do it. Amazing. But yeah, I did been doing some intense research on trying to understand how this thing could so easily be passed through, where even Frederick Douglass acted like it didn't exist. Like there was no definition of it. There was no debate that I could find about it. And I'm still looking. And then Shaka and I were discussing it further, and he came up with the question is, when did someone start addressing the 13th Amendment and its exception clause in terms of modern day slavery and human trafficking since 1865? Mm-hmm. Any ideas, Scotty Reed?
No, other than I believe I actually just read something. Huey Newton addressed it, Angela Davis addressed it, the exception clause. Oh yeah,
so
Assata Shakur in her autobiography.
Shakur, right.
What's that?
Yes. The 60s and 70s we're talking about, right?
Yes.
So we're then to believe that between 1865 and 1965 that there was nobody who was aware that that thing exists, even during the height of convict leasing.
Well, didn't Frederick Douglass say something about it? I'm not clear on that.
No, he didn't actually address the exception clause. He addressed the amendment itself and found it to be a fraud for a variety of reasons. For instance, he was saying at that meeting that he was at with the Anti-Slavery Society that the amendment would not allow the black man to vote. That amendment, the 13th Amendment, would not allow a black man to testify against a white man in court. Okay. That amendment would not, give these things to the black man until these things came along. Then that amendment was just a gesture. And if anything, even then, as early as 1865, he said that it could lead to us being fooled and a trick played over us where we were put in a worse condition than we were during slavery, which turned out to be true.
I don't know if I agree with him on a worse condition. Is it more prolific? Yes, it's more prolific, slavery is in the United States, but I don't know that it was worse. I just some of the
Reconstruction. It was pretty nasty, Scotty. Remember the Florida stories, for instance? Okay. Where they still had the prisoners of slavery there, and they were starving them to death, and all kinds of crazy torture.
Right. Yeah. You're right. So, but again, pretty horrific things go on today, man. They really do. Pretty horrific things go on today. So, it's hard to say. Sometimes I wish I had a time machine and I could take people back. Digging. Yeah.
I want to know, brother. I really want to know who literally brought this into play. Because, we traced this here at New Abolitionist Radio all the way back to 1777.
I got to say the Black Panther Party is the only, all the years that I've been studying it, the only people I know were associated with the Black Panther Party: Assata Shakur, Angela Davis, Huey Newton. Oh, and Lee Wood.
Yeah. But again, that's like the 70s and 60s, man. And
right.
Like there's this whole century missing where the thing was happening like perpetually, and somebody had to be aware, and I haven't been able to find that. So I'm really looking for that, and I'm also very curious, and I will find out how it was actually introduced to Lincoln. Like, what was the proposal? What was the argument that this exception should be in there? I want to find the debates on that, even if I have to look through newspapers from the 1860s. I'm going to find that out.
I don't think there was much debate, because you got to recognize the fact you didn't have anybody like a Frederick Douglass who had been a victim of slavery, or even a free black person who had participated in the Underground Railroad. None of them were in on the congressional debates, if there was any congressional debates to be had. So I don't know that there was much debate about it. I don't know. Again, we can't go off of movies, but I remember a scene from Spielberg's movie Lincoln about how it might have been a few debates or what have you. But again, I'm going to save my commentary on that for when we talk about John Kelly, because it's related.
Well, let's go ahead and get on to that then, Scotty. I don't know if you want to use it or not, but the other day, one of the first things I heard was on CNN, the talking heads coming on there, and there was one sister, I don't know everybody's name, but she was talking about Lincoln's compromise. And it was over the backdrop of John Kelly talking about how, General Lee was an honorable man, and how people gave their lives for the state rather than for the nation in that time. And he gave up his nation, and talking about, women being treated with respect, like they didn't have a problem back then. It was just this whole lie he was fabricating out of thin air, he'd never read a history book before. And this is the White House chief of staff.
Well, that's some real revisionist history right there, man. And it's not surprising, though. Now, I don't know, Max, if you would call this cognitive dissonance, but I read two articles. No, I was listening to the context of white supremacy. Saturday night, I was listening. They played a clip of this woman defending Confederate monuments, saying that, hey, these people that support the Confederate monuments, they weren't taught that their ancestors were evil. They weren't taught those things, so it's like they don't get it. And I don't know if you call that cognitive dissonance or willfully trying to obfuscate the issue. I mean, damn, if children know that stuff is bad, you know what I'm saying? Children pretty much know right from wrong. Okay, I ain't saying they know it like adults, but they get a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And so for a man of those years, that just tells me something about his character. Anybody who looks at these people and to call a person like that honorable, it's just really giving you insight into their psyche. Now, to the backdrop of that, there was a survey that was just done where you had members of the military saying that white supremacy have infiltrated the U.S. military, and they see that as terrorism and a bigger threat than so-called Islamic terrorism to the country. These are soldiers. These are members of the military who said that. Now, John Kelly is what? An ex-general. There's Exhibit A. I'm sure there's a lot of him like that in there. Max?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You said you had a video or something?
Yes, I have a video that it's just a clip from the news thing that I heard on CNN yesterday, and it includes John Kelly as well as the rhetoric that was posed there by the CNN talking head. Anyway, it's called Lincoln's Compromise. It's on the planning page as well as on New Abolitionist Radio on Facebook, and it's just a few minutes long. So
yeah, I'm trying to find it.
Want to talk about.
I'm trying to find it in the group, so I better go to Facebook since you just posted it there, because them threads be pretty long, boy. Max, like Max has said in the past, y'all don't know how many stories we leave on the cutting room floor, so that's why you should become a member of BTR community.
Right. It's about 3 posts down under the Lincoln stuff that we was talking about, so you'll see it on Facebook as well. And just for listeners right now, we highly suggest that you become a member of the community. The community-bbtr.org. www.blacktalkradionetwork.com, and you can follow all of these things that we often never get a chance to share with people, but it's news worthy of respect. In any case, help support an institution and become a member of the Black Talk Radio Network community. It's $24 a year. And for that $24 a year, you'll get all the things that we can possibly offer, the bells and whistles of a social network, and you'll never see a day in Facebook jail. It just don't exist at the Black Talk Radio Network community.
Yeah, I'm still having a little trouble finding it, Max. I'm on New Abolitionist Radio. Is it near the top?
Do you see
Lincoln's
James
Compromise?
Ashley
I
on the 13th
found it.
Amendment?
I found it.
Yes.
Found it. Lincoln's Compromise.
All right, there you go.
All right.
Compromise, yes.
Here we go. Should be starting shortly. Here we go.
White House Chief of Staff John Kelly is not one to seek the spotlight, but that is where he is today, after offering his thoughts on the Civil War and how it could have been avoided. Kelly was speaking to Fox News after being asked about a Virginia church's decision to relocate plaques honoring Robert E. Lee and George Washington. Here's what he said.
I would tell you that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man. He was a man that gave up his country to fight for his state, which in 150 years ago was more important than country. It was always loyalty to state first back in those days. Now it's different today. But the lack of an ability to compromise led to the Civil War. And men and women of good faith on both sides made their stand where their conscience had them make their stand.
All right, joining me right now, senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson and senior political director David Chalian. So, David, what is John Kelly doing here? Why is he taking questions about this? I mean, we've seen him in the briefing room. If he doesn't want to take a question, he won't take it.
Yeah, it's a little perplexing why he would want to delve into Civil War history and to do so incorrectly. I think that the question is sort of what compromise is he talking about between slavery and freedom? It's unclear to me what the compromise is there. But I do think that this also just raises the larger issue, Kate, which is that John Kelly is very at home in the Trump White House, and I think we're seeing that more and more over the last couple of weeks as he sort of delves into some more controversial issues. He seems almost sort of Trumpian in his responses.
Oh, and I actually do want to get to that in a second. But Nia, on this very point, as David is saying, we were all aware that there were attempts at compromise before the outbreak of the Civil War, but sitting here in 2017, is it clear what compromise John Kelly thinks the North should have accepted? I actually can't even believe I had to ask that question.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really surprised to hear John Kelly say this. I grew up in the South, and so this is kind of a talking point you often hear from people of a certain age, people of a certain race.
That is never good when you start an answer with people of a certain age. Nia Malika Henderson.
Right, and I mean, even if you look, you go and you look back at the Civil War documentary, which I encourage John Kelly to look at. Shelby Foote, who's a Southern historian who wrote multiple volumes on the Civil War, said almost those exact words, that it was a lack of an ability to compromise. But sort of the fuller context, of course, is compromise over slavery. And how do you compromise over slavery, as David said? And I mean, if you look at what Lincoln was trying to do, he was in fact trying to compromise over slavery, and the South didn't want to compromise over slavery because it was so key to their identity, so key to the economy, so key to the identity of white Southern Christians, and so that is what's going on here. I do think it reflects that the South obviously lost the war, but they sort of in some ways won the narrative battle and kind of the memory of the Civil War, and I think that's what he's speaking to, this idea that Robert E. Lee, who thought that black people basically benefited from slavery. I mean, that was Robert E. Lee's philosophy, right? That slavery was good for black people because they needed to be civilized. He actually thought slavery was bad for white people because they were the ones who had to enslave black people to do them some good. So, the thing about, I think that is also troubling about Kelly is that he does tend to look at the past through these rose-colored glasses, right? I mean, he talked about women being honored in the past and seen in a respectful way. I mean, if you think that women being treated as second-class citizens is honoring them. I mean, that was what the past was. And he also seems to be impervious to new information, right? I mean, if you look at the Frederica Wilson controversy, right, he had the story completely wrong. The truth of what she said came out, and he still refused to apologize, refused to change his approach to that story. So, you know, you would hope that John Kelly will read about the Civil War. I mean, it's probably the most covered war and period of history in American history. I mean, multiple volumes, hundreds of thousands of books are written on that period. So you would hope he would read a little bit more and kind of broaden his idea of what that war was actually about.
Well, there you go, Scotty.
Well, let's just, I want to address his comments, not so much of what their comments. I want to address his. All right, so we heard what he said, right? There's a bunch of the racist dog whistles. Okay, that's the Southern strategy right there. What we heard when we what was some of the man, let me go back. I should have pulled it up, man. I'm trying not to do too much so I don't lock up my screen. But I heard a bunch of dog whistles there. And when this is a man who took an oath to the United States, took the same oath I took when I joined the military. And for him, states' rights, that's the word I was looking for. We hear that today, states' rights. So that was just red meat for the racists that turned out to Charlottesville and the terrorists, you know, that killed that woman, Heather Heyer, and those other people. All right, states' rights, what state rights? The right to practice slavery is what they were fighting for. That's why they broke away. Now, in terms of Lincoln, trying to compromise, he tried to compromise. And this is what I told someone today, where this person was trying to say that, hey, all of this liberal outrage towards John Kelly and about compromise and all this and that. And I was like, you know, in a way, John Kelly is right. People did not want to compromise. See, Lincoln had wrote letters to, what was it? Stevens is his last name.
Alexander Stevens.
Say that again, Alexander?
Justice Stevens, yes.
Yes, wrote the letter saying, you know, do you think that we plan to interfere with you and your property? Please tell your fellow, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, please tell your fellow slavers that we don't plan to do anything to interfere with the institution. We just don't want it to expand to the new territories where we robbing Native Americans of their land, okay? So he tried everything he could do to prevent the war and keep the Union together. So John Kelly, he sounds like an insurrectionist today. He sounds just like one of them Southerners, right? Okay, so I don't know what his home state is, but remember we heard that talk about certain Southern states in the past few years talking about seceding from the state, secession. During the Obama years, that was big talk. So what, John Kelly, you know, what would you do? Would you recommend the U.S. military soldiers betray their oath to the United States and join in with their states? I mean, this dude is trying to make something that is dishonorable honorable. And I'm not falling for it. And the greatest, even after the Civil War, the great compromise. Lincoln, if he had acted like normal people act during war when you're dealing with traitors, every last single one of those Confederate generals and officers, every single member of the short-lived Confederate Congress would have been shot or hanged for treason. Okay, that's what should have happened. But he was always trying to appease those slavers because he said in his own words, I don't care if slavery remains or if it's to go, as long as the Union stays together. So again, he's a very wishy-washy. I don't even want to call the man an abolitionist. Okay, I think he was a double-talking politician who saw opportunity to become the nominee for the Republican Party, which is first nominee, and he just told abolitionists what they wanted to hear. And his real thoughts came through his letters to these Southerners. So I'm going to stop there, Max.
You touched on a lot of subjects, right?
I know.
No?
I said I know. That's why I want to stop.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of subjects. I'll touch on a couple as well. One, starting with his own statements, as you said, he's now romanticizing it. He's a revisionist. You know, he's just making things up out of thin air in order to justify what they're involved in right there. And that was a prediction that was made by Frederick Douglass in his denouncement of the Emancipation in 1888. We said, the love of power common to the white race has been nursed and strengthened at the South by slavery. Accustomed during 200 years to the unlimited possession and exercise of irresistible power, the love of it has become stronger by habit. To assume that this feeling of pride and power has died out and disappeared from the South is to assume a miracle. Any man tells you that it has died out or has ceased to be exercised and made ineffective tells you that which is untrue and in the nature of things could not be true. Not only is the love of power there, but a talent for its exercise has been fully developed. This talent makes the old master class of the South not only the masters of the Negro, but the masters of Congress, and if not checked, will make them the masters of this nation. I denounce this so-called emancipation as a stupendous fraud by Frederick Douglass, 1888. So he warned of it right there, you know. And you got to remember also the period, how those people thought at that time during the 13th Amendment's presentation initially. It's because it went through three stages. You know, there was three different 13th Amendments. The first one was about not having any titles of nobility. The second one was the Corwin Agreement, in which slavery would never be abolished. Like, you couldn't even try to abolish it. It was forbidden by the Constitution. And then the final one, which is what we see now, which is kind of like the 1777 Vermont State Constitution with the exception clause. But let me read some of the words of the people of the time and how they felt about it. And you'll see that's how they feel right now. Like, everything they're doing is right.
Right, Max. I was going to say, before you read that, when you said that, I was thinking, because that's something they try to use to justify slavery, while not acknowledging that it still exists, is that, oh, that was a different time period then, and so we have to view it through that lens and what have you, as to justify slavery as, oh, it was okay back then, it was normal, nothing was wrong with it. Well, that's a doggone lie, because there has always been an abolitionist movement for as long as there's been slavery, so everybody was not down with it and okay with it.
But here's the sentiments of the people who were okay with it. And I found this in some research from Harper's Weekly, May 23rd, 1864. And it was after the debate about the 13th Amendment. Of the 6 senators who voted against the resolution, 4 made brief speeches. Mr. Powell of Kentucky said if there had been no abolitionists, there would have been no rebellion. An inanity too incredible. Mr. Salisbury of Delaware proposed to secure liberty of speech and of the press and reestablish the principles of the Missouri Compromise, which was a proposition to feed a fire with water. For how can slavery and free speech coexist? Mr. Davis of Kentucky declared that the constitutional abolition of slavery, a wicked and unjust act against which he was aware the protest of an angel would be of no avail, forgetting that the only angel who would have wished to protest was named Lucifer and fell from heaven. Mr. McDougall of California announced that he was devoted to human freedom and therefore, as a true friend of man, should vote in favor of slavery. Now, this was the sentiments of sitting politicians at the time about slavery. They were often portraying it as a loss to the master race. So they were saying, you're impugning on my rights to own property, never once mentioning that the truth of the matter is they were taking the rights away from the people who had been enslaved. That wasn't the point for them. It was always about what they were losing and not the human cost that was being enacted. That was negligible to them.
Right. You know, I read a blog post today. I'm sorry I don't remember your name if you're listening. But someone in my social network made a blog post, very first blog post for their blog site. And it was about racism and white supremacy. So I go read the blog, and it was a pretty well written blog for his, he was trying to play it down like, hey, I need a lot of work, and hey, we all need improvement, but I thought it was pretty good. But it was just one thing that I pointed out to him that I took issue with, not in a negative sense of the word, but was pointing out to him that slavery, that white supremacy, because he compared white supremacy to slavery. He said white supremacy is slavery. And no, slavery was here first. And I pointed out to him that white supremacy was not codified in law until the passage of the Virginia slave codes, which, in addition to regulating the movements of enslaved victims, but also stripped free black colonists of their rights to defend themselves, of their rights to bear arms, all of their civil rights. That was the beginning of the what would we call it, institutionalization of white supremacy in law. That was the beginning, and it was done to maintain slavery, not the other way around. So I just got to point that out. Also, again, another thing with John Kelly, he's just an old curmudgeon, man, just a gnarly old man. And we just see that Trump attracts these type of people. Not to say that any previous administrations were any better on the issue of slavery, but this administration has gone all out in supporting modern day slavery. You mentioned the GEO group, and we'll be talking about them later, but I read in an article 2 days ago that the GEO group had moved this conference from wherever they were booked at to a Trump hotel. And where was the hotel at? Was it in Virginia or was it in Maryland? I can't remember where their conference is going to be, but they moved it to a Trump hotel. Remember, they poured billions of dollars, and some people say illegally, into a super PAC to elect Donald Trump because he was very upfront with his support of slavery.
Yeah, just thinking this is coming from the chief of staff of the White House, and to not think that this would not reflect in his counterparts in the Congress, in the governorships, and in the Senate. Like, you think they're smarter than him, like they know more than him? They're all in agreement, a lot of these, particularly in the Republican parties. They don't have knowledge. What they have is tradition. They just believe things because that's what they've always been told. Mm-hmm. And they apparently haven't read a book since grammar school.
I'll tell you something else he hasn't read, like man. Another thing he hasn't read is the writings of a descendant of General Lee, who is a counter-racist, who is named, well, he shares the same name. I think he's the 6th or the 5th or something like that, Robert E. Lee or whatever. Anyway, he talked about why these monuments should be removed because, again, Kelly is saying all these things in defense of monuments being removed from the public square. Okay, so even General Lee, as was pointed out today by a panel member on Tanya Free and Friends, even General Lee said after the war was over, not to be flying them Confederate flags, not to put all that stuff away. Okay, not to be trying to memorialize all of this. So they even going against what General Lee said himself.
Literally. Just making it up out of thin air and then want to argue with somebody about it. And then the press secretary also carried on even further. And, just there's a few stories you can look on the news and hear the whole
Chuckles?
Rhetoric. Everybody was
Chuckles, you talking about Chuckles?
Yes. I try not to get too caught up in these thrones because I recognize these powers and principalities that we're dealing with and what they really represent. It's a whole lot of evil going on here. And we make the mistake sometimes, Scotty, of thinking that every monster looks like Godzilla. Like a monster can't be the most beautiful, handsome person, charming person you know. Like the same guy who's in prison as a guard, working $8, $12 an hour, and in his free time is beating people up or running fight clubs, doesn't go home and hug his wife
or
give
raping
his children
prisoners.
Christmas presents. You know what I mean? Like he's got to look like a monster because he's doing monstrous things, and that's just not the case. People like Abraham Lincoln were monsters. People like Thomas Jefferson were monsters. Yes, there was some beautiful, genius, wonderful things that went on in their lives, but that goes on in everybody has moments like that. Everybody has these types of lovely things that we can do and beautiful and gracious things, but not everybody is capable of the levels of evil that these men have went through. I mean, literally, Thomas Jefferson was wasn't he one of the first people to talk about people as
capital.
A commodity, as
capital,
stock,
capital
as capital, right? You're talking about Thomas Jefferson.
He was
and he's
bragging.
the guy saying freedom.
Yeah, he was bragging to his fellow slavers that every time a victim of slavery was born on his plantation, how that increased his capital, his wealth. And so, there has always been a direct connection or correlation between slavery and capitalism of the West.
And between sociopathy.
Yeah.
Because it takes sociopaths to do this. And by nature, sociopaths seek the highest forms of power. So don't be surprised that we had more than a few presidents who were sociopaths, like the one we have right now is a sociopath. And if you don't know what a sociopath is, look it up. Matter of fact, the corporation, since the advent of the what is it called? We're now with the corporation's personhood. Help me out, Scotty. I'm having a difficult day in brain parts.
You're talking about. I know what you're talking about. Mitt Romney talked about that. Mitt Romney said corporations are people too. And
well, it's actually legal by the Supreme Court now.
Yeah, because of free speech. They're saying money is free speech, and corporations have a right to free speech. They're covered by the First Amendment. And so they could, but look, me and you as citizens don't have the right to pour unlimited amounts of money into an election. We're limited how much we can give an individual candidate. But with these super PACs, you can give an unlimited amount. So that was just the end around the law, or so to speak. But again, man, these people to say
Citizens United, Scotty.
Citizens United. That's correct.
Yes, it is.
Yes, that's correct. Hey, Max, there's one thing I wanted to say on air to issue a correction to some information that I've said that wasn't correct, and somebody made me aware of it. So I want to acknowledge that. I had heard somebody mention, and I might have misheard them, but they said that Lincoln did pay the slavers for the loss of their property. And I'm like, no, that's not right. That's not right. I said the 14th Amendment specifically forbade that. But somebody, Chris Adair, I believe is his name, he shared with me via private message a document about Lincoln approving to compensate the slavers in Washington, D.C. And they did. They paid them, man. They paid them. And I had just posted a quote from Lincoln the week prior where he was saying, well, and I'm paraphrasing, but he was like expressing doubt of whether or not he wanted to do it. So Lincoln did compensate some slavers for the emancipation of their victims, but that was limited to Washington, D.C. only.
Man, speaking of compensation, you want to talk about that GEO Group's statement about how much money they're making and where their dollars are coming from these days and why they're so happy? And for those that don't know, GEO Group is an international corporation that specializes in providing prison services and buildings and facilities and training and so on and so forth. They've even managed bases like Guantanamo Bay, the Palestinians in Israel, and to the best of my knowledge, they have a contract right now with the nation of Australia, providing all services
correct.
for all of their prisons across Australia. They're huge. They have a base in Florida, and their CEO is by the name of George Zoley. If there were ever a modern-day slaver baron, George Zoley would be one of those people who need to have a wanted ad made up for them.
I did make a wanted ad for him.
Yes, you did. This is what I'm referring to, yo. Wanted. Well, apparently they are happy and pleased with the way things are going under the Trump administration. They said corporate leaders at the Florida-based private prison operator GO Group are very pleased with its third quarter earnings report released Tuesday on a call with investors. GO Group's CEO, George Zoley, expressed optimism for profits, largely driven by current contracts with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE agency. We are very pleased with our strong quarterly results and outlook for the balance of the year, Zoley said on an investor call, explaining that the third quarter experienced improved occupancy rates across a number of our ICE facilities. I mean, they say it, Scotty, they say it so surgically, like, it just don't matter. Experienced improved occupancy rates across a number of our ICE facilities. Like, you should just be saying we shoved more bodies in those buildings and it made us more money.
Mm-hmm.
Out of the 96,000 beds within its private corrections and detention facilities worldwide, Zoley said the company had 5,000 vacant beds at 5 idle facilities and 2,000 underutilized beds across a number of active facilities at the end of the third quarter. He did not specify whether those vacant beds were located in the immigration detention centers or in prisons. We continue to actively market this available bed capacity and believe that there are a number of opportunities to deploy these assets. Wow. Zoley said, explaining those extra 7,000 available beds could generate between 50 million and 60 million in revenue if they're fully utilized. As reflected by earning call slides, the ICE agency is GO Group's number one customer. GO's 2017 year-to-date data showed that ICE uses 16% of the GO's bed spaces and comprises 18.7% of GO's revenue. And when you're saying ICE, you're talking about the U.S. government. That's a contract with the U.S. government. In any case, in comparison, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the company's number two customer, uses 14.3% of GO's bed space. So we're talking about almost 20% and then 14%. So we're talking about 34 to 35% of their contracts is directly related to this administration.
Yeah,
so,
the federal
I'll put
government.
that up on New Abolitionist Radio. You can read about it in full detail. It's a lot more to it.
Yes, and they also have contracts with individual states as well. But like you correctly mentioned, we reported when it happened, they took over the entire prison system of Australia. So when we tell you that this is slavery is an international issue, it is most certainly an international issue because these are companies that are operating internationally. Okay. And so if you live in the United States or if you live outside the United States, you should become an abolitionist because they might be coming to your town soon, no matter where you are. Okay. I see right. Again, like we pointed out, Max, the largest employer in Africa is who? And they do what?
G4S, which is a prisons and securities company.
Okay.
Largest private employer 5 years straight. Now, the entire continent of Africa.
Now, I saw that, and let me ask you this question, because I've had these out for years since we started doing New Abolitionist Radio. I've had alerts out for when they do these calls because it will be made public. Unless I've been missing the emails, I don't recall getting any heads up about the calls. Have you?
Yes, but unfortunately, over the years that we have been doing it, it was usually Johannan that would make sure they would collect that up and cover it every month, or every 3 months that it was coming out. So I don't think either one of us has taken up that like he was doing it. Although that may change in the future, Scotty, because what we discussed recently about another potential host on behalf of the Millions of Prisoners Coalition, We've had that conversation now with their end, and they're working it out, and that may be coming into fruition. I don't want to say too much just yet, Scott.
Okay, I understand.
To the audience, but you know where I'm coming from, right?
Right, but so I did not know this, that they had this call, because normally we would be calling in, and we would try to ask questions, but they would never take our calls. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is some of those calls, and we did record those calls and publish them, and I'm sure they're aware that we was doing that, and we would hear like little small, what you might call mom and pop companies that was on these calls invested in modern day slavery. So I'm reading here about this one call, this one company that was part of the call. Let me back up. I'm trying to find it right quick, but they are talking about, okay, let me see. The company is currently in the process of developing a 1,000-bed ICE processing center in Houston, Texas, under a 10-year contract. J. David Donahue, Senior Vice President and President of U.S. Corrections and Detention and International Operation. Again, I just told y'all slavery is still international. It's still international, y'all. And he said on the same call, the facility, which is set to open in late 2018, costs $125 million to build and is expected to pull in $44 million annually in revenue. Okay, they just put down $125 million on slavery. They are so sure that they're going to fill them prison, because they probably going to have a 95% occupancy rate from the government, like they got with Louisiana. I think that's core civic with the contract with Louisiana. But
most
I think about
contracts
that.
are 80 to 100% guaranteed occupancy for 20 to 25 years. I think it's CCA that has guaranteed 100% occupancy in Arizona in at least 3 prisons.
So they are investing a lot of money, people, in your enslavement. What are we going to do about it? Is it time to end this?
Yes, it's way past time to end this, Scotty. And you know, while we're doing the fight, which should be done now, like every day, we should be finished. This should be it. It should be done. That's how I feel about it. But every day that we fight, we're losing more people, more brutality is occurring, and more horrors and more atrocities are occurring, because this is all at a human cost. As I expressed earlier, when they talked about the losses, they talked about the losses to slavers. The slavers got paid for what they lost. Nobody really cared about the human loss, and that's the way it's going right now, particularly here in South Carolina. And considering this is my last day here as a resident, let me share this information regarding the ongoing human rights crisis happening here in the South Carolina prisons. I've been getting reports now for months from friends of ours and abolitionists who's been telling us of how they've been treating these prisoners in there. Everything from one man getting 36 years in solitary confinement for 36 Facebook posts. Think about that. 36 years in solitary confinement for 36 Facebook posts, to them painting all the windows green and putting nets over the outside area so the men can't even look up at the sun clearly during the day, like literally locking them in their cells 24 hours a day. And this article is coming from Shadowproof, and it's journalist Jared Ware. He interviewed people incarcerated at McCormick's Correctional Institution in South Carolina regarding the ongoing crisis, therefore a special edition of Beyond Prisons, and I want to read some of it. It says, McCormick has been on lockdown for weeks. At the end of September, incarcerated people reported officials there withholding drinking water and engaging in excessive force after a water main broke outside the facility. For 3 days, people on the inside reported they did not have drinkable water. This caused tensions in the facility to boil over into multiple incidents, which were met with more repression by prison staff. Incarcerated people feel staff are intentionally trying to provoke them just to justify worsening brutality and repressive conditions. One man was reportedly shot with rubber bullets multiple times after leaving the shower. He has been transferred to another facility after he was taken after he was taken to the prison's medical center. On Monday, October 30, advocates report people had briefly taken over the restrictive housing unit and set fires before returning to their cells. Few news outlets have covered the crisis from the perspective of the people on the inside, instead relying exclusively on reports from correctional officials who claim the violence was a product of unruly prisoners and staff shortages. This claim has been used to justify the lockdown, as well as the presence of riot squads and officers from nearby prisons. Prison staff were said to be violating multiple department policies. Under the lockdown, people are being held in their cells 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They say medical attention is being denied, which has been particularly dangerous for those with diabetes. The prison is not providing adequate meals, and unpalatable food is being served with guns drawn and pointed in the direction of each cell they open to pass the food. To add another degree of psychological torture, steel plates are being used to cover all windows. Members of Jailhouse Lawyers Speak reported on Twitter, natural sunlight is being eliminated in the cells at McCormick Prison. Incarcerated people are reporting the facility is only allowing one cell at a time to bathe, limited showers to once a week. Hygiene products have not been delivered to cells. Living conditions are becoming increasingly unsanitary, as well as cells and showers have not been cleaned. Another prison in the South Carolina system, Broad River Correctional Institution, is reportedly on lockdown as well. Advocates are asking the public to call the following officials on behalf of those incarcerated at McCormick. That will be South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, 803-737-9000. Assistant Attorney General John M. Gore, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, 202-514-4609. South Carolina Senator Carl Allen, Corrections and Penology Oversight Subcommittee Member, 602 Grissett Boulevard, Columbia 29201, business phone 803-212-6008. And finally, SDDC, Office of the Director, Brian P. Sterling, 803-896-8555. They are requesting a formal investigation related to water rationing and the use of excessive force at the facility. Incarcerated people are also asking for normal operations to resume without delay and for inhumane living conditions to be rectified immediately. And you can read the rest of that again at New Abolitionist Radio or at the Black Talk Radio Network community.blacktalkradio network.
Please make those calls, because if you don't, nobody will.
If you're able, do it. If you're able, do it.
Right.
It's amazing.
But again,
wow.
When you mention call the Civil Rights Division, the first thing that came to my mind is slaves don't have civil rights. That's the reality of the situation. That's how they will respond. Slaves don't. That's why the Justice Department Civil Rights Division is not constantly investigating these prisons and busting them for the violations of these people's civil rights under the Constitution, let alone the international human rights treaties that they have signed. Because you know why? Because they slaves. That's how they look at them. That's what they are legally. I'm not calling them slaves. They're victims of slavery, but I'm speaking from the perspective.
Property of the state.
Exactly. Property don't have rights. So I just, when you said call the Civil Rights Division, that's the first thing that came to my mind. So I'm just being brutally honest here so people will recognize the situation that is going on. It's slavery. It's not mass incarceration. It's not over-policing. It's none of that. It's slavery. Slavery. What has slavery always been about? For profit. That's what we're dealing with, people. And if you don't stand up for those, and not that the people in prison haven't been standing up, because they have. You've heard from over the years some of the prisoners call into this show. and what have you. So they are standing up, but they need us. They need us. So if you was one of those people that was like, if I'd have been born in the 1860s, I definitely would have been an abolitionist. I'd have been working on the Underground Railroad. I would have signed up for the Civil War to free these people. Well, you in the same circumstances right now. What are we going to do, people? We need to end slavery. So please become involved.
Yes. What we're going to do at this point is we'll take our station identification break. And when we come back on the other side, I want to talk about debtors' prisons that are filling up, they say in this article, in the Deep South, but I know that it's happening everywhere across America. You're listening to New Abolitionist Radio right here on the Black Talk Radio Network.com, the official program for the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights Coalition. We'll be right back after these messages.
Radio Network. For podcasts and live program scheduling, visit us on the web at blacktalkradionetwork.com.
Welcome back to New Abolitionist Radio. I'd like to open up the call lines, too, before we get into our story too deeply on the next story, at least. If you have a question or a comment, just press ** if you're in the room there and unmute yourself. And state your name, where you're calling from, and what your question or comment is.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
Okay, then. So what I'll do is I'll start on our story, and if you have something you'd like to say, just unmute yourself after I finish with the story, and we can share your comments. This comes from workers.org, and it's published October 28, 2015. It's 2 years ago. It's nothing new. This has been taking some time. Debtors' prisons fill up in Deep South. Across the U.S., local jails have turned into debtors' prisons as cities and counties imprison poor people who can't pay fines for traffic violations, minor offenses, or court costs. Nowhere is this more dramatic than in the Deep South, where imprisoned people are disproportionately young Black people, immigrants, people of color, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer people. In Alabama, Perry County Circuit Judge Marvin Wiggins told a courtroom full of people at an unpaid fines hearing on September 17th, if you do not have any money and don't want to go to jail, consider giving blood today and bring your receipt back, or the sheriff has enough handcuffs for those who do not have money. That came from the Equal Justice Initiative, and we reported on it when it occurred here at New Abolitionist Radio, where the judge literally said, sell blood and give us the money. Deborah Shoemaker Ford from Shelby County was jailed there for 7 weeks with no court hearing. Her crime? She had not paid the monthly fees charged by a private probation company, Judicial Corrections Services, JCS. The company based in Georgia had provided her bail for a traffic violation. From the MarshProject.org. Excuse me. The Chilton County retired ill steelworker Richard Garrett was jailed for 2 years and owed $10,000 simply for traffic and license violations, plus fees and fines accrued over 10 years. New York Times, July 2nd, 2012. Jailing someone for debt who is too poor to pay is a civil rights violation under the 1966 UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is also illegal under the 1982 U.S. Supreme Court ruling Bearden versus Georgia. But though debtors' prisons are not allowed de jure by law, they are on the rise de facto as part of a prisons-for-profit boom of the last 20 years. Offender-funded initiatives throughout the U.S. justice system have shifted much of the costs for the system to the prisoners themselves. Economically squeezed cities and counties have actively adopted this approach to add to their revenue stream. Local governments also augment revenue by contracting with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to arrest and jail undocumented immigrants in order to fulfill quotas to keep beds filled at for-profit detention centers run by corporate giants like Corrections Corporations of America, formerly now known as Core Civic, and Geo Group. Incarcerated immigrants then incur costs in the local fee stream. Predatory companies like Judicial Corrections Services are contracted by local cities and counties to collect fines, restitution, and fees from convicted or incarcerated people, boasting they are saving taxpayers' dollars. The profit-driven companies hound poor people for all kinds of fees, including jail, booking, public defender application, drug testing, DNA testing, drug rehab, electronic monitoring, as well as jail per diems for pretrial detention, court costs, and more. The private companies charge the local governments nothing. They make their profits by adding extra fees to court defendants' bills. The companies are bill collectors with the power to decide if someone goes to jail for not paying. Poor defendants have the right to legal counsel in criminal cases, but not in civil cases such as indebtedness. That leaves poor defendants at the mercy of profit-hungry companies like JCS. You can read the rest of this story at New Abolitionist Radio. I think we covered the gist of what's happening right here. And again, this is from 2015. Since then, we have seen some wins come into play, like a fight against JCS in Alabama, forcing them out of the entire state under RICO charges.
And we first proposed that. I was just thinking America is Ferguson, the series that we did on the report, based off of the report that came out of Ferguson after the murder of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson. And the FBI went in there, the Department of Justice, and they produced this report, and they mentioned federal laws had been violated. But no, there was no prosecution. So me, you, and Johannen was kicking that back and forth and breaking it down. And I was like, the only thing I could think of is RICO charges. And then so when you look up RICO charges, that does apply and can be applied. And, you know, we are not attorneys. We also don't have the funds to have attorneys on retainer to fight these sort of cases. But I think, who was it? Was it the Southern Poverty Law Center that sued them under RICO and won? I believe it was the Southern.
I'm reading it right here. It says last January, the ACLU filed a similar suit in Georgia against DeKalb County and rapidly reached settlement in March, achieving limited systemic reform. Under this pressure, the day after the ACLU suit was filed in Mississippi, the JCS announced it was ceasing business in Alabama.
Okay, so, but I do believe the Southern Poverty Law Center, that's neither here or there, but what we were theorizing as a way to attack this element of slavery, it's been proven. So I'm not criticizing you, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You get a lot of money from black folks, and they are the primary victims of slavery in this country. You have a separate from the other NAACP. That's a total separate entity, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Why aren't you filing these suits all over the country on behalf of the victims of modern day slavery? That's a question. That's not a criticism. That's a question. Because we just told you that these other groups had success in shutting down this Bell's Bondsman company. So I'm just saying, man, I want slavery to be over yesterday. And if I was to hit the lottery and won $500 million, you better believe I will be going after these people in the courts.
Yes, sir, Scotty. We were talking about that today here with Shaka and Tribal, and just some ideas that we could use to make these things happen. One of those I mentioned earlier is a very simple one. We are developing here an institution called community.blacktalkradionetwork.com. We want you to join it. It's $24 a year. That money is going to help fund a lot of efforts that are happening. Like we're in the midst now of beginning the initial stages of forming our committees in order to address the individual exception clauses in state constitutions. And simultaneously, in California, there's a group called Initiate Justice, which is attempting to allow the prisoners within the prisons to be able to vote. So they're having a voting drive for those prisoners and getting petitions together, because Jerry Brown now is allowing them to vote, to be able to make that happen. So it's potential that we could be using prisoners' votes in order to overturn these exception clauses in state constitutions. So that's a wonderful thing that's happening, like real stuff that's happening in the streets and behind the lines. But Scotty, I want to play one more video before the evening was over and we got into our regular segments. And that's the rampant constitutional violations at our everyday life video. I'm going to put it on New Abolitionist Radio, so it'll be the first thing you see when you go over there. Just give me a second here. Okay. And it's a clip that was suggested to me to watch from Otis Griffin. So I watched the whole clip, the whole thing. I pulled this part out. I figured that we could talk about this. This is, let me read the introduction here. This is a clip from On Contact with Chris Hedges, Alex Vital, author of The End of Policing and professor of sociology and coordinator of the Police and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, discusses the origins of modern policing and how to prevent law enforcement from stripping away citizens' rights. So if you're ready for it, you can go ahead and play.
Programs that allow police to expropriate property and money, and what that has done to police departments.
Well, this is just one of the forms of corruption that emerges from some of the functional roles that police have been given in this era. So, most importantly, the war on drugs has radically expanded police power. It has eroded the Fourth Amendment, and the asset forfeiture laws that were created as part of the war on drugs.
Explain how those work, because you don't even have to be convicted of a crime.
No, only your money does.
Yeah.
And the standards are civil standards, not criminal standards, which means that it only requires a preponderance of the evidence rather than guilt beyond reasonable doubt.
In the book you talk about how these police forces will go out, I think you call them fishing expeditions.
The way the asset forfeiture laws are generally structured is police get to keep all or a significant share of the money, and they have created their own internal...
Well, and the vehicles,
and houses, and anything else they find. But what they really want...
And let's be clear, what they're doing is targeting someone who they think is dealing in drugs.
Well, no, I don't even think they necessarily think that. The targeting is so much vaguer than that. And in some cases, there's evidence of targeting people just because they think they have money on them. So they're making stops and claiming that, based on their own internal decision-making, that, well, anyone who's carrying more than $500 must be up to no good. Because what law-abiding person would be carrying $1,000 with them? The fact that that person is on the way to the doctor's office to pay a bill or has just come from a check cashing place is not of interest to them. If they're suspicious of that person, they make a confiscation right on the spot, and then you have to prove that your money is not guilty after the fact.
Which most people can't do.
Many people certainly can't do that. They don't have the financial proof that the money has been garnered in a particular way. And, there are large segments of the economy now that operate on a cash basis. And those people now are at risk from this kind of predatory policing.
Well, you see it with the fines in places like St. Louis and Ferguson.
That's another example. And across large parts of the South, it's especially common in rural areas as state funding for local places has declined as part of austerity politics. Local areas are trying to make up that money through fees and fines.
Which get ridiculous. Like you can't stand more than 3 minutes on a street. You didn't mow your lawn.
Right. Not only are the laws ridiculous, but the patterns of enforcement are ridiculous. And then the fact that judges go along with this is a further outrage. And in some cases, it's resulted in debtors' prisons where people who can't pay the fines are coerced into getting money from friends and family, not just to bail themselves out, but to come up with a deal on all the fine money, and they can't get out of jail until they pay it.
You are quite critical of what's called the broken windows policing policy. Explain what it is and why.
So a lot of what's happening in terms of the over-policing of communities of color is not about arresting homicidal maniacs or rapists. It's about the constant, invasive, harassing, low-level enforcement of very minor violations of the law.
This is Garner selling loose cigarettes,
which shouldn't even be a police matter. But the mayor of New York, like many politicians across the country, is committed to this idea that if they aggressively micromanage the public behavior of poor people, that will lead to public safety, a revitalization of neighborhoods, etc. But the whole precept behind it is fundamentally racist. We know that the architects of this theory were of a mind that poor people are, by their nature, incapable of regulating their own behavior, and it's only a coercive state that will force them to do the right thing.
You say it's essentially it shifts the burden of responsibility for the declining living conditions onto the poor themselves.
It was revolutionary. They took what was a very well understood idea that poverty and social dislocation leads to crime, and instead said that it's disorder that produces crime.
There you go, Scotty.
We do have a phone call before I comment on what we just heard. Oh, okay. I guess they had just came in and the system was slow in muting them. But anybody that has a question or a comment, the telephone number is 866-510-9025. Hit **. We'll see you come unmuted and we'll get your question or your comment. I'm going to just say this about that. I agree with everything that was said. But today on social media, which people tend to do, it's nothing new, bad-mouthing professional athletes and saying that, and I don't believe it because they didn't provide a link to the study or the survey, but they said that 100% of African-American boys want to be a basketball player or a football player or, a professional athlete. And my response to that, I didn't say, well, where's your proof and all this? Because I know people tend to think of professional athletes as slaves. That's why I don't like metaphors when we got real slavery going on and they ain't being paid millions of dollars to play a game. All right. But I said to him, you know what? I'd rather my grandsons want to be a football player rather than a slave catcher or a prison plantation overseer. So if that's true, I'm thankful that they would rather be professional athletes than professional slavers. And so that's all I got to say about that. Think about that. All right? Because he gonna say to me in response, oh, you gonna say that, but the black community want cops to understand them. And I'm like, the black community don't need no cops to understand us. We need them to leave us the heck alone. That's what we need. We need for them to stop coming into our communities with these little petty fines on poor people that lead them into prison or into the jail, cause them to lose jobs and just, keep that cycle of poverty going. I said we need for them to quit gunning down people with their hands up and all. And this was a black person I was talking to. And he just didn't seem to get it. Okay? There are worse things in this society than playing professional sports that your children could aspire to be.
That's right. You could be a monster and not look like one. With this here asset seizure laws that are going on is a constant violation of our Fourth Amendment rights, constant violation of our Sixth Amendment rights, constant violation of our Eighth Amendment rights. 95% of the people who are sitting in jails right now are there because they can't afford to get out, period, which is a violation of the Eighth Amendment that guarantees protection from excessive fines, fees, and bails. But apparently that's not in play anymore. Same thing with the trials. We don't get them. There's no speedy trials in existence. 95% of all cases, federal cases and state cases on the average, end in a plea bargain. That's 95%, not 5%. Almost all of the constitutional amendment is being violated. Only 5% are getting trials. And when it comes to debtors' prisons, in the United States, debtor prisons were banned under federal law in 1833. A century and a half later, in 1983, the Supreme Court affirmed that incarcerating indigent debtors was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So now we've got the 14th Amendment being violated every day. And we don't really hear any outcry from the organizations you would suspect would be champions of constitutional violations, like the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we don't hear it enough. So you need some more speaking on that one for sure. But there's articles where they explain how some of these police go out with wish lists. We have reported stories here where sheriff's departments are getting upwards of $250,000 in salaries every year because of the extra money, which is more than, if not as much as, their annual salaries that comes in from these asset seizures.
Bonus.
They use this money to buy everything.
Bonus. That's how they get that boat. That's how they get that, take their little family on a vacation to Disneyland and all of that. So again, and then we got certain element of this society that won't talk about a police state. Yes, I'm talking about Alex Jones. When I first became aware of him in 1999, he shared some good information, and he wasn't showing his racism like he's showing now. But now you compare Alex Jones 1999, where he was saying this is a police state. Now he's on the side of the police. In fact, we played a clip of him where he was telling people to run over protesters and stuff who were protesting police brutality. So again, I say again, there are worse things that children could aspire to be in this society. Yeah, we want them to be doctors, lawyers, educators, scientists, and all of that good stuff. Artists, musicians, and what have you. But everybody don't have the talent or the intelligence to make it in those fields. And so again, as long as these children ain't talking about being slave catchers or jail overseers, where they're talking about we can't let these people go because we need them to change the oil in our cars and do all this work. No, there are worse things that your child could be.
Yeah, this is what we've been doing here today, is putting it all together so you can see these different aspects of it and how it's, it really is just infects every aspect of our society because of how the slave trade was transformed through convict leasing, and how convict leasing became what we know as mass incarceration and policing for profit. But it never stopped being slavery. It's always been slavery. Even Frederick Douglass has warned us that this thing is going to come with names and different names, and it's had different names, and it'll have more names. And we need to pay attention for what new name this monster will come up from under. Just to kind of wrap up this part, and then I did want to talk a little bit about the November 4th event. But just to wrap this up and bring it back home, is I want to read that letter, Scotty, that was written by Abraham Lincoln in 1860, December 22nd, to A.H. Stevens, his competitor at the time. And
his competitor, they were friends because he was in Congress too. That's how he met him, was in Congress. They were friends.
Yes, he explains that in the letter, as a matter of fact. But at that time, they were in competition for the election.
Oh, so, okay.
At that period in 1860. So he writes this letter to him, and he uses a specific word that you should pay attention to, and that is the word restricted. And you have to ask yourself, what does Abraham Lincoln mean when he says it ought to be restricted? He did not use the word abolished, and he did not use the word ended or anything like that. He said restricted. So this starts with Abraham writing, "For your eyes only, Honorable A.H. Stevens, my dear sir, your obliging answer to my short notice just received, and for which please accept my thanks. I fully appreciate the present peril the country is in and the weight of responsibility on me. Do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administration would directly or indirectly interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, as once a friend and still I hope not an enemy, that there is no cause for such fears. The South would be in more danger in this respect.
No more danger.
And no more danger would be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. I suppose, however, this does not meet the case. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub. It is certainly the only substantial difference between us. Yours very truly, Abraham Lincoln. If you've ever read any of Justice Stevens' writings, you would see one of the most racist, sociopathic, murderous, genocidal maniacs you can imagine.
And that was his friend.
And that was his friend.
Mm-hmm.
He was telling him clearly, we got a plan. You don't need to worry. The South is going to be okay.
Well, Max, I want to know who is we. Because we apparently did not include Frederick Douglass. We apparently did not include William Lloyd Garrison. We apparently didn't include John Brown and his sons and all those others who worked with him. We apparently didn't, all the abolitionists that we highlight, I can't imagine them saying, I've never read them saying, we think it ought to be restricted.
The congressman from Ohio, the senator from Ohio, the senator from South Carolina, and the senator from New Jersey were all involved in the we.
So that's the we, not
Ashley,
the abolitionists, not the abolitionists.
Well,
James
Ashley was a proposed abolitionist. He even worked on the Underground Railroad, apparently, and he was a congressman and a governor. He is the man that literally gave the written exception clause, the 13th Amendment with the exception clause, to Abraham Lincoln as a proposal that it be ratified by Congress.
You can call yourself whatever you want to call yourself. Your actions speak louder than words. When I look up the definition of abolition, it don't say nothing about restricting.
So that's the mystery that I'm on right now, Scotty, and I'm sure you'll be on it for a while, and our listeners may be on it for a while too. I want to find out who actually put this together, who came up with the idea, where was the debates about it, who argued against this specific aspect of the 13th Amendment, this exception clause, and who defined it. Where is that information available? I'm sure it's out there somewhere. If you know, let us know.
Well, again, Lincoln actually gave them everything. So here he is in 1860, just telling them. Okay, so again, this goes back to what's the chief of staff name again? John Kelly. This goes back to him talking about there was some truth in what he said about they wouldn't compromise. It was the South that wouldn't compromise. They wanted to, instead of them being satisfied with what they were already doing, they wanted to keep expanding it and expanding it and expanding it. And this is before the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, there have been no more compromise from me. It'd have been the gallows for these people. That's what it'd have been after they committed acts of treason. And then slavery would have been abolished. But did he abolish slavery? No. He gave them what he was telling Alexander Stephens what they thought. It should be restricted. And that what is that restriction? Is that they restricting it to the prisons through the exception clause of the 13th Amendment.
Yep. And it happened so quick, like everybody knew their part to play as soon as the exception clause was ratified. Immediately, for some unknown reason, William Lloyd Garrison wanted to disband the Anti-Slavery Society, like immediately. And the prisons here in South Carolina, which were built that very next year, 1866, or opened that very next year, went from 90% white to 90% black in 24 months, in under 24 months. And you can rest assured that the black people were not getting the same treatment that those white inhabitants had just had that were populating it prior to that. So that was a quick transition. And then they went through the whole period afterwards with the Reconstruction era, where the South got a chance to rebuild its economy. And it didn't do
reconstruct slavery.
Huh?
Reconstruct slavery.
Right. In Alabama, 80% of their state revenue was coming from, in the 1900s, convict leasing. So how did they go? They didn't, nothing changed. You went from 80% of your revenue coming in from slavery to 80% of your revenue coming in from convict leasing. And as Jay Mancini said, the only difference between slavery and convict leasing was with convicts so plentiful, they were seen as disposable. So for the slavers, the people who was managing these human bodies, it was easier for them because they no longer had to care about anyone's health or well-being or provide for them. They were literally had become property that was disposable.
Right. They didn't have any monetary investment whereas they just snatched them off the street and charged them with one of them black code laws that they passed, which is represented today by things like the so-called war on drugs and the asset seizure forfeiture laws. People ain't nothing really changed. They just refined it.
They attack your money. Now your money got to defend itself. Like, your money is guilty until proven innocent. You might be innocent until proven guilty, but the money is guilty until proven innocent. We're going to take it all. Even to the point where I believe there was a story that's linked in our article there where a young boy sold $40 worth of weed on his front porch and the police took his parents home for it. Wow. So with that, unless there are any more comments or from our listeners or callers, anybody want to say anything else, I want to transition to the Antifa event that's coming up and go over that briefly and then get into our final segment. So, Scotty?
Yeah, no, there's no one on the board, but we can take our last break.
Okay, you're listening to New Abolitionist Radio. We're talking about modern-day slavery and human trafficking, and we're proud to announce that we are the official introductory program for the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights Coalition. We'll be right back after these messages.
No, I'm not a writer.
Okay.
Black Talk Radio since 2008, providing new black media for the masses.
Welcome back to New Abolitionist Radio here on the blacktalkradionetwork.com. We want to talk a little bit about the upcoming November 4th event. You know, I've got some friends who are comrades in the anarchist movement and in Antifa, and they actually asked me, Max, could you come out and march with us to have you there? They're expecting to have a relatively peaceful march. That's their intention. They want to have sustained protests, but they want to in regards to the fascism that is happening in the United States and against Trump in particular. And I think that's the only thing that made me say, you know, I don't really want to march against Trump, because that would be like fighting mass incarceration. Trump is just the latest face. He's not the first racist president, and he is certainly not the worst racist president. He's just the latest racist president. And yes, he has a lot of potential for destruction, but not just for one community anymore. He'll screw everybody over now. So welcome to the club. In any case, as I said, based on the reports and the people that I know, They said the organizers of the protests on November 4th are hoping for a nonviolent demonstration reminiscent of the Women's March earlier this year. So that's their intentions, but they want to do it in a sustained way. And I can agree with that. But apparently, a lot of these right-wing organizations are jumping on this opportunity to possibly make a very deadly move. You can see in one video a fake policeman with an iron-on badge sitting in a fake police car with a real-ass rifle behind him, or semi-automatic weapon, talking about, attacks that are going to be happening on American citizens. And there's another guy who's saying that now the racists have planned to use this opportunity to initiate a civil war, and they're going to just go out and start shooting black people wherever they can find them. If you just Google the event, you'll see titles like War. Antifa plans nationwide terror attack for November 4th. November 4th, fast facts you need to know. Deep state planning, anti-Trump protests in 14 cities, November 4th. Antifa planning nationwide riots, November 4th. Conspiracy claims civil war, blackouts planned for November 4th. And Scotty, I know you've seen that story too, this unsourced story about how there's going to be an EMP that's going to take out all the power. This is pretty amazing, but it's dangerous because they're taking an opportunity for people to use their voice and exercise democracy as it should be, as an opportunity to potentially start shooting and killing people like they just recently did in New York.
Or Charlottesville.
Yes.
And many other places throughout the United States that we don't hear about. But I just heard about this story early this morning, about 9 o'clock this morning. Somebody had sent me a video. Then later, my sister sent me the same video. And so I listened to the video of these two women, and they saying go to the DOD website. There's going to be an EMP, and all the electricity in the United States is going to be knocked out and all this. So I went to the DOD website. I couldn't find anything. And the only source that was provided to me is from a site that has been known to get it wrong. I'm not going to call them a conspiracy theorist website because that term gets played out. But let me just say they've been known for putting out incorrect information. And so I ain't paid no mind, but all of a sudden I'm seeing this blow up. I mean, this video had already been seen about 900,000 times when I've seen it, when I saw it this morning. And then I'm seeing all these people in my timeline talking about it. So I was like, let me see if I can source this. I was unable to source it. I said, this is likely a hoax. I also saw somebody else share saying that there were going to be riots by Antifa. And I was like, I've only been hearing that from right-wing trumpeters and what have you. I said, I don't believe that. Now, you the first person that I spoke to that has confirmed that there will be protests, but not national riots, not, going out there to commit acts of violence or destruction and all of that good stuff. So I just like to tell people we have to start doing more critical thinking. We have to not just share everything that's shared with us without us first checking the information. In journalism, they say you want to have at least 2 sources. You want 3 ideally, but, the standard is 2 sources, 2 independent sources confirming the same thing. Well, we got a bunch of those websites out there putting out a lot of incorrect information, so I don't think 2 of those would qualify. But there's a process, people, and I'm really speaking to the people who have an audience on social media, who I know share information a lot, and a lot of the information is good. And you hurt your credibility with the people that look to you for this information when you don't do your due diligence and your homework to source it out. And sometimes you won't be able to source everything out, okay? But you should at least try. To me, that's a form of mind control. So I'm not going to tell people what to do on the 4th, but I'm not going to be caught up in it. All right, I don't march anyway to begin with. I not that I don't see the value in it as a recruiting tool and as a public awareness tool. It's just that I just don't march. I just don't. I'd rather report on it and provide support that way. But I don't march. But Max is right to raise the alarm. Be very careful, because like one of the things I was saying was that people could be putting this out there to make something pop off. And I think that's exactly what Max just said. They trying to get something started. So while I don't think an EMP is going to happen, if you don't already have a Faraday cage to protect your electronics, or made a Faraday shield to shield, the electronics of your car, again, this EMP is not going to happen, people. The DOD put out a Twitter that they're going to have an amateur. It's the ham operators. They're going to simulate a communications blackout, which will be one of the things that could happen if an EMP went off. But do you really think the government will be telling you that, hey, we gonna set off a real EMP just to see how people respond? No, they not going to tell you that. Okay, if that was to be the case. But if you don't already have those things, considering some of the stuff that Max just talked about, you need to be buying some guns and some bullets. That's what you need to, how you need to be preparing, okay, to defend yourself from these very real threats of these terrorists out here. And we got an administration, and again, John Kelly defending terrorists, Donald Trump defending terror. Oh, there were good people on both sides, is what he said about the Charlottesville attack. Did he say that about that dude running down people in New York? Did he say, oh, there are good people on in ISIS and Al Qaeda? And no, he's not saying that. So the government ain't here to protect you black people or non-white people or would be anybody that would be a target of these terrorists. So you need to be preparing to protect yourself. All right? That's my thoughts on it, Max.
I have hesitant advice, Scotty, because, the reality of the circumstances is we live in a state of terrorism, constant terrorism, particularly minority communities have always been in that constant terrorism. You and I have stood together in my daughter's community where the police were roaming, and they weren't roaming, they were hunting. And you saw them just as well as I did.
Yes, hunting.
People living in poverty and under adversity, with little babies running all around, without parents there for them. That's the circumstances that people live under. Now, everybody else in the country is starting to live under them very same circumstances of a police state. So anything is possible. You could have a guy shooting from a window and kill a bunch of people at a concert, or somebody ride down a bike road and kill somebody, or somebody ride through the protests and kill somebody. These things can happen. Just keep that in mind and keep your neck on a swivel. Paranoia might save your life. And I'm not going to tell you to be brave. I'm going to tell you to be careful. Just walking down the street is being brave these days with these nutcases out here doing the things that they're doing and being empowered by our own president of the United States and the Congress and the Senate are really empowering these nutcases.
Yes, they are, Max. Well, I'm in full agreement with you. Keep that head on a swivel. You ever heard the term defensive driving? Well, you got to do defensive walking now. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And if you're taking your babies with you, keep in mind that you're risking.
Please don't take no babies out there.
Scotty, I've taken my babies under all the circumstances.
I'm talking about what is planned for the 4th. Please don't take no children out there.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest. I think this is an adult circumstance. I want to see how this unfolds, and I'll keep everybody reported on my page. Well, Scott, it looks like unless you have anything else you want to cover, we're on our final segments of the evening.
No, sir.
It's been a real good program tonight. A lot of things came out, a couple mysteries, as a matter of fact. I think we'll start with, let me pull something up here. All right. I think I don't.
I'm looking for, okay, I have the abolitionist in profile. And while I'm doing that, you could do the other one. All right.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. This profile has been published by Max on New Abolitionist Radio. It was published Sunday. Our abolitionist in profile is Elizabeth Freeman, 1742 to 1829. She was born into slavery in Claverack, New York in 1742. Upon suffering physical abuse from her enslaver's wife, Freeman escaped her home and refused to return. She found a sympathetic ear with attorney Theodore Sedgwick, the father of the writer Catherine Sedgwick. Apparently, as she served dinner to her enslavers, she had heard them speaking of freedom, in this case, freedom from England, and she applied the concepts of equality and freedom for all to herself. In 1781, Freeman, with the assistance of Sedgwick, initiated the case Brom and Bett versus Ashley that set a precedent for the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. According to Massachusetts Judicial Review, the 1781 Berkshire County case of Brom and Bett versus Ashley, often referred to as the Mumbet or Elizabeth Freeman case, was unique because it occurred less than 1 year after the adoption of the Massachusetts Constitution, and because, in contrast to prior freedom suits, there was no claim that John Ashley, the slaver, had violated a specific law. This case was a direct challenge to the very existence of slavery in Massachusetts. Once free, Freeman stayed with Sedgwick family as a servant. Sedgwick, in arguing a later case, used the example of Freeman when he said in defense of the abolition of slavery, if there could be a practical refutation of the imagined superiority of our race to hers, the life and character of this woman would afford that, how you say that word, refutation? Yeah. So
refutation, yes.
Refutation. So our abolitionist in profile is Elizabeth Freeman, 1742, 1829. Salute.
Salute to Mumbet. Indeed, man.
Again, this goes back to when we were talking about the RICO charges with the JCS company.
Mm-hmm.
This goes back to us mounting a challenge, in mounting efforts to remove the exception clause of the 13th Amendment, not only the federal constitution, but the state constitutions. If you did not hear attorney Akeisha Shabazz, who was our surprise guest last week, I specifically asked her, she's an attorney, I specifically asked her, what would it mean to remove the exception clause of the 13th Amendment? And then she said that opens it up to all kind of lawsuits and legal proceedings, because then you become, once you say that slavery is forever abolished, now when you pay prisoners in California to risk their lives fighting fires, you got to pay them at least minimum wage. And when you got to pay them minimum wage, like has been said, I think we was talking Angela Davis, we said something last week about Angela Davis. If you combine all the hours that are worked by people in slavery, it would amount to billions of dollars annually. They ain't trying to pay nobody in prison. You got to remove the profit incentive, people. If there's no profit incentive, they don't want to spend money where they can't make money. So, like some old I ain't gonna call them old, some elder revolutionaries who have been in either prison as political prisoners or were part of the Black Panther Party told me that we should be doing everything we can through every channel, and that includes the courts, that includes using a vote, pending revolution. Okay? Because we can't sit around waiting for a mass uprising and another civil war to break out. We got, like Malcolm said, by any means necessary. If that means challenging stuff through the courts, if that means removing the exception clause from these constitutions, we got to do whatever we got to do to bring relief to these people.
Speaking of relief, Scotty, that's our next segment, is our rider of the 21st Century Underground Railroad. This week, we have a different way of getting out of prison being presented. So today, our rider is Bobby Hines, and he's out of Detroit, and this happened 2 days ago. Bobby Hines stepped forward smiling as he embraced the sister of the man he was convicted of killing. Locked up for 28 years, he long wanted to meet Valencia Warren Gibbs to talk with her about that night in '89 when her older brother James was shot after Hines and two others confronted him in a feud over drugs. At 15, Hines had been condemned to life in prison without parole. Now he was out. 43-year-old man navigating life in a city he'd left behind as an 8th grader. Slowly, he was checking off things he needed to do. He'd already found work, enjoyed a meal in an actual restaurant, and learned how to take photos with his new cell phone. And on this Sunday, 20 days into his freedom, he'd come to sit down with his victim's sister and take responsibility for his role in Warren's death. You know why, he told her, tapping a forefinger on the table for emphasis? I'm never going to forget what I did. He would not forget, but he could make amends, move on, and do his best to make the most of his extraordinary second chance. After nearly 3 decades behind bars, he was learning what it meant to be Bobby Hines again, older, hopefully wiser, and a stranger to the world of 2017. We made it, Hines declared, almost inaudibly, as if he'd just crossed an imaginary finish line. He walked out of prison at 9 a.m. promptly on September morning, arm in arm with his sister Myra, who beamed, laughed, and rested her head on her brother's shoulder as they approached an SUV waiting to whisk him away. More than 10,000 days had passed behind bars, but to hear him tell it, Hines had refused to believe he'd die on the inside. God ain't going to let that happen, he'd said, ever confident that one day he would find his way to freedom. And we here at New Abolitionist Radio salute you and say welcome to freedom.
Salute and welcome to freedom.
Yes, sir. And I guess we're down to our final one. Wrap this up in a nice, neat bow, as we always say. Past, present, and future all put together here on this program. Today we're going to remember in the slave revolt of 1842. Of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees were the largest holders of Africans as chattel slaves. By 1860, the Cherokees had 4,600 slaves. Many Cherokees depended on them as a bridge to white society. English interpreters and translators. Mainly, however, slaves worked on farms as laborers or in homes as maids and servants. The Cherokees feared the aspect of a slave revolt, and that is just what happened in 1842 at Weber's Falls. On the morning of November 15, more than 25 slaves, enslaved Africans, most from the Joseph Van plantation, revolted. They locked their masters and overseers in their homes and cabins while they slept. The slaves stole guns, horses, mules, ammunition, food, and supplies. At daybreak, the group, which included men, women, and children, headed towards Mexico, where slavery was illegal. In the Creek Nation, the Cherokee slaves were joined by Creek slaves, bringing the group total to more than 35. The fugitives fought off and killed a couple of slave hunters in the Choctaw Nation. The Cherokee Nation sent the Cherokee militia under Captain John Drew with 87 men to catch the runaways. This expedition was authorized by the Cherokee National Council in Tequila on November 17, 1842. The militia caught up with the enslaved Africans 7 miles north of the Red River on November 28, 1842. The tired, famished fugitives offered no resistance. The party returned to Tahlequah on December 8, 1842. 5 slaves were executed, and Joseph Van put the majority of his rebellious slaves to work on the steamboats, which worked the Arkansas, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers. The Cherokees blamed the incident on free, armed black Seminoles who lived in close proximity to the Cherokee slaves at Fort Gibson. On December 2, 1842, the Cherokee Nation passed a law commanding all free African Americans except former Cherokee slaves to leave the nation. And we here at New Abolitionist Radio remember the slave revolts of 1842.
And shout out to the descendants of their victims, because they've been battling in court against them to, I wouldn't call it reparations, but the Cherokee Nation expelled them from the tribe, because they were citizens of the Cherokee Nation after the Civil War. and they kicked them out. And so they sued in court and they won to get their citizenship to the Cherokee Nation and all the benefits that entails restored. So, people fighting, man, on so many different levels. And so I just want to acknowledge them in their victory.
Indeed, brother. Well, we're at our closing last couple of minutes. Do you have any final comments for the evening, Scotty Reed?
Yes. Again, I just want to say how proud I am that New Abolitionist Radio is now the official radio program for the Millions for Human Rights Coalition. We will do our very best to represent, which I feel like we do that every time we come on air. We try to represent this issue in the realest way possible, bringing you facts, bringing you stories, and there's never any shortage of stories. Max probably got about 20 stories that we didn't share tonight. Okay, yeah. So this is a very real issue, people. And pre-1865 slavery didn't end itself, and prison slavery today via the 13th Amendment is not going to end itself. It's going to take abolitionists. Join the movement.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Scotty. I would like to say we're looking for volunteers to help in a multitude of ways in our efforts to establish a multi-state voter initiative to remove individual exception clauses to slavery from state constitutions. If you're interested, go to facebook.com/amendtheamendments. That's facebook.com/amendtheamendments, and leave a hashtag volunteering under the request for assistance. That would be hashtag volunteering. So we know that that's what you're doing. We're trying to pull together teams now across the country to fight this thing head on. Also, Sister Layla Aziz is working out in California with Initiate Justice to start voter drives for prisoners. So she'll be needing assistance with that as well. We'll keep you updated on it, and hopefully some of you volunteer your time. But most of all, like every week, I don't say this because I don't believe it. I believe this is the true way to end all this. You talk a lot about revolution, but abolition, slavery abolition, is a reason for a revolution, so we can finally know some peace. Peace.
Rise up, 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 rise up. Showtime. Just lift your eyes up. Let your wise rise up, see the signs of the times. If it's time, rise up, rise up. When death and hell dwell among all God's people, when those we chose and trusted have become completely corrupted and inherently evil, when the feast that feeds you starves our father's children, when snuff, porn, and pedo forms begin to get top billing, rise up. When famine claims millions, when justice gives blind eyes to billions, when the Lord's anger is no longer feared, if his protection is gone and your enemies are near, if you've seen the seas spill over and the mountains shake, break, and fall, if the moon ever turns blood red and you can't see the sun at all, rise.